Good afternoon to you all, and welcome to this Sustainable Cost Reduction webinar presented by the Executive Education Unit at the University of Adelaide and Mr. Max Zornada. I can see that there's 18 of us in the room. There could be a few others that will join us during the course of the presentation, and they'll just you'll see them come in and out. I'll just go through a little bit of housekeeping to start with. Firstly, with my name. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Andrew Stevens, and I'm the Director of Executive Education here at the University of Adelaide. And I would like to welcome members of our alumni and also other guests that have joined us today for what promises to be quite an interesting topic, and I also think quite a timely one as well. I'm going to run through a little bit of housekeeping just to get you familiar with the actual screen itself, so hopefully you can ask some questions. So what we've got here is, you'll notice on the right hand side or the left hand side, depending on which way you're viewing your screen, there is a presentation viewer or window, and that's your control panel. And the control panel will allow you to raise your hand, ask questions, and also select audio mode. So, and you can also collapse that when it's not in use, and I think as an attendee it probably automatically collapses. And to keep it open, you can just click on the view menu, which is located at the top, and uncheck auto hide control panel if you want to see that all of the time. Now, in order to ask questions and give feedback, if you have a quick look at a closer look at your control panel, and I'll show you a slide now that will highlight that. So if you have a closer look, first of all, everyone should be on mic and speakers. For this particular webinar, telephone is not enabled. You also have on the left-hand side there, you'll notice a hand with a green arrow. You can put your hand up, and that will allow you, if you have a mic and a microphone connected to your speaker arrangement, to ask a question. And I can actually unmute you at a particular time during Max's presentation, and you can ask that question directly to Max. Alternatively, underneath where you see the question panel, you can type a question in there. I will see the question come up, and I can ask that to Max at the appropriate time. If you would like to, depending on how we go for time today, we can wait to the end of today's session, and then any questions we can ask at the end if you haven't had a chance to have them answered during the course of the presentation. And I would invite you really to put your hand up and speak to Max, because I know that it adds value not just for yourself but to the other participants as well. The next screen will just show you again a little bit of a highlight of how to raise your hand. So just onto the next screen, just highlighting raising your hand, and I will see that as well. Now that's all the housekeeping. Feel free to type questions in if you have some problems with your console, and I'll try to address them as Max is speaking. But now let me introduce Max Zornada, who will be taking over shortly. Max is a management educator and consultant with extensive experience in teaching at MBA level, in executive education, and in management development seminars and programs. He's a hands-on practitioner, and he has consulted to major corporations on a range of organisational and strategic issues throughout Australia, the US, the Middle East, the UK, Western Europe and Asia, with a specific focus on achieving business and operational excellence. Currently, Max is an adjunct lecturer at the University of Adelaide Business School, where he currently teaches operations management, business performance improvement, statistical and quant analysis, all in the MBA program. In recent years, a major focus of his activity in consulting has been in business improvement, Lean Six Sigma, training and implementation. Good afternoon to you, Max.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Thank you for that impressive introduction, and I welcome everyone who's chosen to join us here this afternoon.
Excellent. So I'll hand over to you, Max, and we look forward to hearing a lot more about what is going to be obviously a very interesting and timely topic.
Okay, yeah. Well, I guess the economic conditions of the last few years have led a lot of organisations to look at how they can make rapid improvements, particularly when it comes to rapid cost cutting. Just in the past week, in preparing preparing for this webinar, looked at a number of newspaper headlines on strategies that companies were using. One that was announced back in May, which was probably one of the biggest ones, was Hewlett-Packard looking at cutting, in fact the figures being upgraded since to 30,000 employees as part of their cost cutting. And Shiseido, who's a Japanese cosmetics company, just announced this past week major restructuring and cost cutting. We see companies like Cisco in the banking sector. We've seen a lot of the major banks in the US in particular looking at significant cost cutting and layoffs. Closer to home, this past week we've seen BHP put the brakes on the development at Olympic Dam. So that's been delayed. The current thoughts there will be delayed at least 2 years and possibly more. BHP have also this year closed down 2 mines, the Norwich Park coal mine, which is on this particular slide, but also in Kalgoorlie, one of their nickel mines was closed, and Shell announced that they'll be closing the Sydney refinery as well as Caltex announced a closure, all aimed at reducing costs. They felt that those refineries were just not cost competitive. So we see that either in a weak economy or in response to increased competition and budgetary pressure, that cost cutting is often the strategy of choice that organisations turn to first. Unfortunately, the way that most companies implement cost cutting is not terribly effective. Typically they cost cut across the board in a way that aims to really spread the pain across the whole organisation. And this is often perceived to be the best way to do it, to limit political infighting, but it's often leaves the organisation weaker and smaller as a result of the cost cutting. So when things improve, they're often not placed to take advantage of the improved environment. So we need to start to look at different ways to cut costs, ways that develop rapid results, but more strategic approaches. That means that organisations don't effectively damage themselves through the cost-cutting strategies. I've just listed here some of the typical measures that organisations take when they're looking at cost-cutting. We've seen the examples I gave before, which all of them involve significant staff retrenchment, but also we see cutting back on training, salaries, promotions, and often outsourcing operations is quite a popular approach to cost-cutting. There was an interesting study done by a guy called Cascio, who's a HR consultant and academic, and he did quite a detailed study of organisations that responded to the recession that was triggered by the 1987 stock market collapse. So there was a period from about 87 to 92 where there was quite a bit of turmoil, and organisations responded by aggressive cost cutting in many cases. And he determined that, in fact, of the organisations that got through it, that 70% of them that use major cost cutting as their strategy actually emerged from the recession in worse shape than if they'd done nothing at all. So it's quite a telling outcome. So I guess what's wrong with conventional cost cutting, and is there a better way to do it? And I guess if we look at the conventional view of costs, is that the organisation and business activity which is used to create the output of the organisation, which in the case of a private sector organisation is directly linked to generating revenues, and in public and non-profit organisations, the outcomes, the outputs of the organisation are creating some kind of community or social benefit that is of value, that the activities drive cost because they require resources, and not only do they require resources, they can often, the way those resources are deployed in terms of how much overtime is paid and when the work is done is also a key cost driver. Usually in the private sector organisation, when times are good, if they can keep a spread between the revenue and the cost, then that's not a problem. If, however, the spread between revenue and cost reduces, then they often turn to cost cutting. In public sector and non-profit organisations, the environment that we see in the last decade or so is where there's the challenge to deliver more. Community expectations are greater in terms of what they expect from government, but in real terms, budgets are shrinking in real terms. Even though there may be more money in absolute terms, the population served and the range and scope of services that are demanded means that we're seeing real shrinkage. And so the challenge is to make efficient use of the available funds and to be perceived to be delivering adequate value. Now, when it comes to cost cutting, the conventional approaches to cost cutting is that we reduce activity and resources. So often if there's overtime being worked, contractors being used are the first to go. And then we may downsize resources in terms of working hours or even letting people go. So that undermines our capability to produce the output. And so if our output reduces, then we're going to see in the private sector environment less revenue. In the public sector environment, the outcomes that are produced are going to be of lower in volume and quality. So typically, we're reducing the organisation's capability to produce the outcome. It leaves the organisation usually worse off regardless of whether they're in a private or public sector environment. One of the risks is that we get into what I've called here the cost-cutting doom loop, where if I've got my private sector version of the doom loop on this particular slide, is that by focusing on cutting resources and costs, that what it does, if you sort of go around anti-clockwise from resources, the workload on the people that are left increases. And so their ability to produce good outcomes and the service levels they deliver to their customers reduce as a result of that additional workload, which leads to increased customer satisfaction and increased customer churn and defections, which then hits revenue. So there's less revenue. And if the amount that revenue declines is greater than the amount that the cost-cutting measures have been able to reduce costs, in fact, the main impact of cost reduction is to actually make the problem worse because profits decline. And many organisations get caught in this doom loop of where their response to declining profits is to try to reduce costs even more. And so then we go around the loop anti-clockwise one more time. And again, if the revenue deteriorates by more than the costs improve, the results of cost cutting is actually to make the situation even worse. And in Australia, we've seen a real live example of this in recent years in the Qantas's effects of cost cutting. Qantas have been pursuing very aggressive cost cutting since Jeff Dixon took over as CEO almost a decade ago. And in the face of aggressive cost cutting, we've seen their international division post a record loss this last year at a time when their major competitor, Emirates, has, according to last weekend's financial review, is now the most profitable airline in the world. If you look at the public sector and non-profit environment, we have a similar effect, even though quite often it's the revenue and the profit is not there to be measured, but the customer dissatisfaction and churn leads to the perception that there's been a deterioration in quality of life, and that in turn reflects on the perceived competence and public image of the service quality of the service organisation. So often there's a perception that the service deliverer is not really up to the task, not doing their job. Now, I guess, how do we go about this differently? How do we take a more strategic approach that's sustainable, that doesn't lead to the doom loops or this declining capability? And it's to really look at costs in a different way and try to understand the drivers of costs. And one approach, which one of several approaches which is useful, is to isolate what I've called on this particular slide core costs. And these are the costs that are associated with the core activity that is the value-adding activity that is the purpose of the organisation. So the output, the outcomes that the organisation generates, whether it be private sector or public, the core activities are the only thing that generate outcomes that go to the end customer. But in most organisations, there's a whole bunch of other costs. There are a whole lot of support activities that need to be put in place to support the core costs. There's often discretionary activities, and then there's a whole lot of activities that are just wasteful activities, things like rework, things that are caused by inefficiencies. And the idea is to think of cost cutting in a way that protects the core, so you're not compromising the value-adding activities that create the outcomes from an organisation's customers, but to focus on in decreasing order of priority, waste first, discretionary costs second, and support costs third. Quite often you find that support costs are overinflated because a lot of what's in the support cost is also existing to support the activities that are in the discretionary and waste area. For example, an organisation that generates a lot of waste because of poor quality, let's say in a product manufacturing environment, would be employing a lot more quality control inspectors than an organisation that generates less waste. So the quality control inspection would be seen as a valuable support role, but how many you need is going to be dependent on how much waste there is. So if by reducing waste, we then reduce the need for as much support. That's just one fairly straightforward example. But there are lots of areas around the organisation where there's significant support costs that exists because of the existence of discretionary and wasteful activities. So what I've tried to map out on this particular slide is really a flowchart, methodology flowchart that looks at how would we go about going down the track of a sustainable cost reduction project, one that's likely to give us some very rapid cost improvements, as well as a byproduct generate, give us insights into some longer term things that we can do. So what I propose to do is just briefly go through these sort of step by step to give you an overview of what's involved. And the 2-day executive program that we have on in about a month's time or so on the sustainable cost reduction, we're going to go through in detail what the methodologies are, how to use them, look at some case studies that will give people skills practice and how to apply this stuff. So this is just an overview of what some of those key methodology elements are. Really, the starting point is to conduct a high-level diagnostic review and have an overview of the organisation and identify what the facts are. So there's often a lot of anecdotal evidence that's not supported by facts. There's a lot of opinions. So the idea is we want to understand what the facts are. And the information that's collected during the diagnostic review, one of the key uses is to help us understand the cost structure, what are the key cost drivers, and what are the key levers that are available to management to influence costs either up or down. Often one of the byproducts of the diagnostic review is that we find what often is referred to low-hanging fruit, some very quick and easy things that we can do that improve the situation, but the general purpose of that diagnostic review is to get the information to develop the high-level cost structure model, and then drill down by understanding our value chain, our core processes, and decompose those core processes, develop a low-level operational cost model that links to the high-level financial model. And that allows us to have an excellent understanding of the cost structure of the organisation, what the sensitivities are, what drives it, what options we have to change it, what areas are more critical, what areas are less critical. We can then use that information to understand the drivers and identify the opportunities through modelling and developing different scenarios of what the business could look like. So effectively, the result, those models give us a cost map of the whole business, and we can look at different scenarios and how we might create them. And we can apply a technique called Pareto analysis to find the areas that we're going to have the biggest impact. Now, for the benefit of those that are unfamiliar with the Pareto analysis technique, I've just put together a slide that clarifies what it is. It's named after Wilfredo Pareto, who was an Italian economist who did a study in 1906 where he determined that 80% of all the land in Italy was owned by 20% of the people. And that came to be known as the 80-20 rule, or the Pareto principle, which in general terms is that a few causes account for the bulk of the effect that we observe. And Joseph Durand showed that this was in fact a much more general principle that could be applied to business activities. So in a cost reduction application, the idea is that a critical few causes will drive the majority of the costs. So in our analysis of our cost model, what often you find that there are a number of key areas which, if we were to focus on those, we would have a big impact on the cost. And the models combined with the Pareto analysis make those obvious. They really stand out as to areas we should focus on. Once we've identified the areas we want to focus on, then it's a matter of attacking those areas with methodologies and approaches that will yield results. And the methodologies sort of cluster into two broad types of methodologies. The first type of methodology I've called analysis-based methodology because it involves doing some kind of analysis to understand problems and what things are going wrong and what's driving waste and inefficiency and high costs. And we have a whole range of tools that we can use to do that. One of the simplest one is in fact to adapt the operational level DuPont chart, which is the tool that we use back here to do both our high-level financial models and our low-level operational models. Quite often, just getting the information out there in this form and seeing all the linkages and understanding the drivers gives you insights into fairly simple changes that can be made that significantly reduce the cost structure without compromising outcomes. So that's in the top left-hand corner, that the low-level operational DuPont charting itself can be a useful tool. So for things that aren't obvious, we can use the Lean Six Sigma toolkit, and in particular a technique called value stream mapping that looks at how the organization creates value and identifies within that process all the sources of waste that occur, the non-value-adding activities that we might be able to squeeze out. And that can be supported by a more formal analysis of waste and sustainability as well. What we find, one of the case studies that I'll be covering during the two-day program is one from Xerox, where in fact looking at opportunities to recycle ended up being a key part of their cost reduction strategy. So where you've got, quite often people think that implementing green techniques and sustainability behaviours will cost the organisation. In fact, there are lots of examples where going to a more sustainable business model from an environmental perspective becomes a major driver of cost reductions. So we'll be examining that as well. Understanding the processes and process flows, I guess building on more traditional process improvement techniques that have been around for a long time, that's always useful. Benchmarking. Benchmarking is often an easy option that's overlooked. If you can find a benchmark partner that does the same thing that you do but for significantly less cost, going and finding out how they do it can often be a valuable learning and adapting what they do to your own organisation. And finally, process modeling and simulation. And again, using the cost models that we developed early on during the first two stages of the methodology, we can look at modeling and simulating different options and assessing which things are going to be harder or easier to do, which things are going to deliver more or less benefit to the organisation. Okay. Most of the techniques that I've just discussed require some kind of analysis, put together some kind of team who's going to go and look for opportunities that aren't obvious without applying some kind of analysis to the area they're looking at. But practice-based methodology approaches are often quite a bit simpler to apply, because in many of the functional areas that businesses operate, such as looking at asset management, supply chain management, work management, project management, and I've listed them around this diagram, as customers and markets, products and services. There aren't known best ways to do these things that lead to the minimum cost structure possible based on what we know at the time. So another approach is to go in and assess the degree to which the organization's existing practices deviate from known best practices, and closing the gap between current practice and known best practice often generates significant cost savings. So here there's often a lot less analysis required, merely an initial understanding that allows you to define what is the current practice, then compare the current practice to best practice, and implementing whatever is required to be done to close that gap, to get much closer compliance to best practice, ends up being the strategy for cost reduction. Quite often, I guess I've shown them as two separate slides, two separate streams. Quite often in practice you do them in parallel, because quite often when you're doing the analysis required to apply the analysis-based methodologies, one of the early steps in this process is in fact to map out current practice. And so quite often some of the low-hanging fruit, or the things that can be done relatively quickly, even before the analysis has yielded too many results in terms of opportunities, is to identify the gap between current practice and best practice and look at actioning some of those gaps relatively quickly. Once the opportunities have been identified, we can develop recommendations. I guess a useful tool in assessing those recommendations is our cost models, because we can develop the different scenarios as to which ones and which combination of recommendations we think we should prioritize the highest. Once those recommendations have been made, then the final step is to implement, validate, and monitor. When it comes to implementation, there's going to be often, you find there's a range of outcomes that need different mechanisms to implement. There's often quick wins, things, very quick changes that are little more than tweaks to the business that generate significant impact. And slightly more elaborate than a quick win is a just do it project. Quite often during the early stages of when we develop our cost models, something just stand out, that here is something that we know what to do. Now that we see, just a matter of allocating a resource to do something, and we get the benefit. So I call those just do it projects. You know, once you've identified the need, there's not a lot of further analysis. It's just a matter of actioning. Kaizen and Lean Six Sigma projects. I guess Kaizen is the term that lean organizations use to describe improvement projects that are done often relatively quickly by a full-time team, typically 5-day full-time for a team of 5 or 6 people, versus much longer time frame Lean Six Sigma projects that's often done by a team over a period of several months, working part-time on the project. Often process re-engineering opportunities are identified, organizational and value chain restructuring. And the last one on this is often IT projects. Quite often IT can be a great enabler of cost reduction strategies, but quite often messy and poor IT can be a major cost driver. And so sorting out the IT strategy and matching it to the organization's strategy can often yield significant benefits. So the objective is to see if we can reverse the doom loop, the direction of flow of the doom loop, and the interaction. So instead of having the cutting the resources, cannibalizing our revenue stream and reducing our profit, if we focus on the drivers of workload, so what generates the need for resources in the first place to create the cost, and if that is reduced, then we're able to often maintain, even increase service level. And so customer satisfaction increases and our customer churn reduces, and revenue goes up at the same time as costs are coming down, which drives our profit higher rather than lower. So ideally, these kind of cycles are often referred to as virtuous cycles. What we want to do is build virtuous cycles and not doom loops in the way that we go about our cost reduction activities. And the diagram I've given here with the different tools and techniques are the kind of methodologies that we can use. Now, I have called the program Sustainable Strategies for Rapid Cost Reduction, and a lot of the things here, particularly these up on the top of the list, the quick wins, the just do it's, the Kaizens, and some of the Lean Six Sigma projects do deliver very quick results. But one of the things that also falls out of this process is some of the longer term realignments and readjustments that make sure that we hold that optimal or minimal cost position in the long term, and that we don't lose the benefits after the initial push or initial wave of improvement projects. Okay, I think that's pretty much covered all I had planned to cover as part of this presentation, and I'd like to sort of open things up to any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Max. It's quite an interesting and obviously relatively complex topic as well. Can I invite attendees to either raise their hand or type a question that I can ask to you, Max? Maybe while we're waiting on that, just a question that occurred to me. Going through this presentation, even in a relatively quick and obviously a simplistic way, it seems a lot more complex than what we would traditionally do as management, or our senior manager would ask us to do to reduce costs, which is get rid of people or other more obvious ways. And I just wonder how, as managers, you know, if the pressure is on us to quickly reduce costs, that we feel may undermine our capability. What sort of suggestions would you maybe pass on?
Well, I think one of the problems is that what are perceived to be the quick slash and burn approaches to reducing cost are often an illusion. I mean, if I go back to this quote here about this idea of rapid cost cutting and just slash and burn cost cutting often leaves the organisation smaller and weaker. So it's actually, you know, one of the things I didn't put on this slide is Cascio said that 70% of the ones that undertook major cost cutting emerged from the recession in worse shape than if they'd nothing at all. Now that's 70% of the survivors. Another statistic he's had, which I couldn't find in my notes for this presentation, was a lot of organisations just went bust, and one of the key causes was the damage they did to themselves through the cost cutting. So some of the things in this methodology are not that difficult to do. The high-level diagnostic, the understanding the cost structure and prioritising opportunity areas, in most organisations with a team of, say, 4 or 5 people working full-time, could probably be done in about a week, 2 weeks maximum. And then when that's been done, some of the just do it's and quick wins can almost be identified immediately. Now, when you compare that kind of time frame with the kind of time frames that a lot of the slash and burn cost cutting is normally implemented across, you find that they're often quite comparable or even shorter. But you can be more confident that the cost-cutting opportunities you identify by using a methodology are not going to be damaging the business as effective, as opposed to just running blind. If I go back to this one, I guess the problem that the slash and burn cost-cutting has is that it doesn't differentiate between these four categories of cost drivers: the core, support, discretionary, and waste. And so a lot of what gets cut is core, and that effectively cripples the organisation going forward. And a lot of what gets actually left and not cut is often waste and discretionary activities. And so it leaves often the organisation worse off.
Okay, we've had a question from Warren. Warren's sort of asked, how do, and probably following on from what you've just talked about, but how do you win top management support for projects that might need significant financial input? And the bit that I'll add is probably to make the cost savings, you've got to invest first. So how would you answer that? How do you get the buy-in?
Yeah, I think there's probably two elements to that. One of the reasons that we construct the cost model is to identify the magnitude of the opportunity, but also and to focus where the biggest wins are going to be. But also when we identify the specific project and specific actions we want to take, we're in a much better position to build a business case, because if I look at some of the times when I've done this with clients, we've constructed the model using Excel, and you can model the future scenario and calculate the financial benefit. And I find senior management often find that kind of high-level financial information very compelling. If you can financially model not just the size of the benefit, but because you've got all the linkages shown in your model, how that benefit is actually going to be realised, then that ends up being a fairly compelling argument to argue against and not approve the proposed projects.
So do we need to all be trained experts and spend years of studies to sort of get to a level where we can, identify in advance, build business cases, implement some of these confusing sounding methodologies?
Well, not really. I guess that's why I think you can do it in 2 days. I think people can get themselves fully up to speed on a lot of these, how to apply these techniques within about a 2-day workshop, which is what we've got planned. And then it's just a matter, it's the application. With time you get better at the more of these projects you do. A lot of the tools and techniques are already out there. Organizations that have already attempted to do things like Lean or Six Sigma or some combination of those methods probably already have people that know the techniques. What this is providing is a higher level framework for how we apply those techniques with a specific focus on cost reduction.
So how does a rapid cost reduction program or the content differ from just coming along and doing, say, a Lean or a Six Sigma or the Yellow Belt or a Green Belt?
It's really the sense of urgency around the improvements. I guess what Lean and Six Sigma and organizations that implement those kind of methodologies are trying to do is build a culture of continuous improvement in the organization on an ongoing basis. What we're addressing here is the kind of situation where you're needing to make a one-off adjustment, either in a turnaround situation or where the costs are perceived to be too high, and you're effectively wanting a one-off reset to the business with a reasonable sense of urgency to get it done fairly quickly. A logical follow-through is to try to build a culture for continuous improvement and applying Lean and Six Sigma concepts in perpetuity. But this is really looking at something that needs to be achieved fairly quickly. Often a business is potentially in distress or can see troubled waters ahead and wanting to accelerate that whole process.
Excellent. Well, there seems to be an end to the questions, Max, unless anyone, while I'm sort of closing out, if anyone has a burning question that they'd like to ask, please feel free to ask it before we close out. Otherwise, Max, thank you very much for you sharing your knowledge and your time with us here.
Okay, thank you.
And to the participants, thank you very much. We hope to bring you more webinar sessions on a regular basis. So hopefully your investment in time with us today has been valuable, and at least you've learned a little bit more in this area, which I think is, is quite, again, I started by saying timely, and I'll probably end by saying timely for most organisations. So thank you very much for attending. Max, as you will know, is running a Sustainable Strategies for Rapid Cost Reduction 2-day program, which is scheduled for Tuesday the 18th of September and Wednesday the 19th of September 2012. If you have any questions about that, please feel free to email or call me directly and we can answer them as we can. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again, Max.
Okay, thank you. It's been my pleasure.
No problems at all. And thank again to the alumni and other guests that we've had with us today. Thank you.